It's awesome. 大家好. Thank you so much for being here and for waking up so early. It's amazing that we have an audience. But it's an absolute pleasure of mine to return to Hong Kong. And the city is one of my favorite places. And seeing the audience in the galleries of M+ yesterday and seeing the people in the fair, it's really, I'm very happy for Hong Kong. I think the Hong Kong is back, full on, even better than before. So for me, it's very important to think about institution making in the region. As someone who used to spend a lot of time working in what I call a legacy institution in the West, returning to Asia last year and really want to think about what is the institutional responsibility in the region. What does knowledge production means today in Asia in the 21st century matters to me deeply. But today I joined with these esteemed colleagues. They all, I believe, really invested in institution making in the 21st century and really redefine what institution could be for the public today. So I want to first open the panel, let them to ground our conversation by introduce a little bit about their context, their publics, and their institution, how it started for all of you. So with that, maybe we start with Storm, which is because you're furthest from us, from Cape Town.
Thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure and honor to be here with all of you, and thank you for being here. So Zeitz MOCAA is a new institution. It opens its doors in September 2017 in Cape Town as one of the first and largest institutions for contemporary African art and its diaspora. And it was a very significant moment, I think, for an institution like this to exist on the continent. And it's also given an opportunity for us who work in this institution to think through critically what a museum could be and should be for our context. There are no real maps for museum making. We have models that we can look at and emulate and respond to. But it is through our exhibitions program and programming that we've been thinking through this notion of curatorial practice as institution making. And I also would like to acknowledge the extraordinary work of our Executive Director and Chief Curator, Koyo Kuo. I'm in her place today. She could not travel due to unforeseen circumstances. But how do we kind of think through what an institution is for the world today? And it's also, I think, important that we understand our work as part of an entanglement with the world. We're not a Cape Town-based institution. We are intricately linked with the global practice, with artists, with Europe, with the so-called West. And then sometimes it's a very vexing entanglement, but it's also a productive one. And I want to quickly talk through some of the projects that we've been doing that I think also has challenged some notions of institution making, museum making. We believe that the museum is a place of gathering. It's important that something very special happens between objects, in spaces, and audiences in that kind of communion, but it's also a place for conversation, engagement, and sharing. One of the programs that we run is the Atelier program. It's a residency that brings artists to live and work in the museum, not sleeping over, but focused on Cape Town-based artists. It really gives an opportunity for practice. It's in the gallery spaces of the museum. And I think why it's also significant for us to think through what it means in terms of museum making is that it also challenges the kind of foundations of what museums sometimes do and can do. It's what kind of materials can you bring into the museum? How does an audience engage with the process of making and demystifying that process also of production in these spaces? I think it's also important that we think through the connections to other parts of the world. Our program is, the contemporary African art story has been framed largely over the past 15 years through, if I can may say, quite generic group exhibitions. It's seen as a territory that is not diverse or nuanced. And an important part of our vision is also that we are writing an art history for our continent and this diaspora. through the voices of artists. So the solo exhibition, the monographic, becomes very significant for us. And that solo exhibitions is a way for us that we narrate a history of our continent. I think the notion of, if I can very briefly just speak to the notion of decolonization. I don't think we're the right institutions to speak about that. We need to invite other institutions to come and speak about that. And I think we also, if there's and I want to say that because I think we are in the process of rethinking what museums are and how they serve the communities and what they do. And I think for us also the notion of underlying decolonizing the museum, I think from an African perspective, is also related to the think about repatriation of objects that are sitting in institutions in the West, and what that kind of return of those objects mean, and how it gets caught up, not necessarily in kind of the front-facing programming of these institutions, but often the legislation and rules that lie behind it around kind of objects returning, for example. Why is it important in contemporary art context? Because it's those same things that also make certain exchanges between institutions like our own and those in the West very, very difficult. And I will maybe speak to it a bit later. But that's our context, and thank you again for the opportunity to be here.
Of course. There's so much to talk about, especially with the program about doing solo exhibition, platforming artists, producing our historical in-depth knowledge of artists from the region. It's also something I think a lot of institutions are doing here on the panel. So Durjoy, tell us a bit more about your foundation in Bangladesh. From my understanding, it has a wide approach. Please.
Thank you, X. Good afternoon, everyone. Durjoy Bangladesh Foundation is a pretty new established platform, only founded in 2018. But within that short span of 6 years, well, reconsidering the COVID impact, we have tried to bring programs and establish spaces to bridge gap between the artists living in East and West, especially focusing the artists from South Asia and promoting them to amplify their practice to not only regionally but also globally. So, and there are many programs that we have adapted within this time. One of the very important programs that we started just right after we established a residency program, we call it Maji Residency. Maji means boatman, and we started this in a program first in Venice in 2019, and it involves the artists from South Asia, the diaspora artists living in Europe, and also the Venetian artists, because so that it is kind of a bridge between the artistic practices and a sharing of the practice that happens between the cultures, between the regions. And then also we also support South Asian artists to their higher educational programs. And I would be very happy to say that with Rijksacademy, we first started the South Asian initiative to support South Asian artists for the fellowship. And it's a program that is continuing, and we support an individual artist that is selected by Rijksacademy for 2 years fellowship. The third term started this year. So these are important programs that we have done, and our main idea is to amplify the voices which are sometimes marginalized, sometimes I would say probably not heard properly. So this gives an opportunity to the cultural art activists or cultural or art practitioners a new voice, and we support with exhibitions, publications, and also the tours for them to enhance their knowledge base. And just to not only, and we also commission projects like, first when we founded in 2018, we supported Kettle Yard in Cambridge University with the South Asian exhibition called Homelands, Art from India, Bangladesh, Pakistan. And the first time we helped to produce Iftikhar Dadi's work, that neon series in Europe. And that work became a very visible. Many of you, if you have visited Sharjah Binale, you have seen it was in the vegetable garden. So these are the production is one of us support. Then this year we supported Colombo Biennial to produce the 4 artist work from Bangladesh. But besides that, we also support cultural restoration in different important institutions which are important but didn't get the public visibility. Just to give an example, like with Wadham College in Oxford University, we selected that there are holy Qurans from 16th century which were produced in Shiraz in Iran, but came to India, and then between 16th to 17th century went to UK, and since then it was there, and it is in their Ferdowsi library, but never been accessed since 1971 because it is in such a fragile condition. So we got together last year with Wadham College to restore this Holy Qurans, not for the Qurans, this is a religious book, but also to give access to the scholars that could access this cultural heritage and cultural properties for them to access. And this also gives an example to other people to come forward to support them. So there are varieties of programs that we do, and this is continuing.
Fantastic. But you do have a space in Dakar?
This is a space that we have initially thought that, as I just mentioned earlier, that COVID has given a lot of scopes and a lot of new thought process. So the space that we built in Dhaka, it was originally a warehouse because we found that there was no one is allowing any art events during the pandemic. So we first started with converting a warehouse, which we store used furnitures of ours. So we started this space during the pandemic, and first time the Italian contemporary art event that we did there during 2020, end of just a slowdown of pandemic. But that place, you can see in the slide, that is becoming a very important place right now. We expanded it to 15,000 square feet space because Dhaka is a very small city having 18 million people. Everything, art space and cultural space is very limited. So having a 15,000 square feet space with a showing our collection, loaning artworks from different artists, and giving access to the public is a great opportunity. And that is also one of the reason that our foundation getting visibility, because we are trying to show it, the work in a more of a decolonized manner, that art can be a global. And art, there's not this. A lot of things need to be done when we talk about decolonization. It's a belief that we need to incorporate, not that we try to be away from what was produced post-colonial time, but we can always show that these are the new narrative that can be presented.
Great, thank you very much. And I think that specific context of the geographic context, I think, is very important because the public understand the institution very differently, which we can dive into that later in the conversation. But Suhanya, now you're the M+. So tell us a bit more about M+ from your perspective.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming to our panel. And it's very nice to be in this world making beyond the West and have these slides scroll through. You know, you're talking to my slides. I'm talking to your slides. And it's sort of like maybe the palimpsest that we're doing is evident in how this conversation is unfolding. But just to take a step back and say, with M+, we are major institutions. So what does it mean to decolonize a very new institution? And I want to go back to the formation of the institution as part of the West Kowloon Cultural District, which undertook a 3-year public consultation with the people of Hong Kong in relation to what kind of institution they wanted to see on the West Kowloon Cultural District. And this is in 2006. And people wanted a museum for moving images, a museum for ink, a museum for design, a museum for popular culture. And the then Museum Advisory Committee that was chaired by Victor Loh, who became my first M+ board chairman, advised the West Kowloon District Authority with his committee to not build 4 little museums, but rather incorporate these many disciplines and make one large institution, knowing that it would be an institution for the 21st century. Within the committee that was formed to advise the authority, there was argument about how to describe this new institution. So already a debate around what does it mean to make a new institution in Hong Kong, in Asia, for the world, that was multidisciplinary, transnational. And so they couldn't, and they were very clear that they did not want to use the words modern and contemporary because these words were so associated with particular Western canons. So there was a designer on the advisory committee, Freeman Lau, and Victor said, you know, we've written our advice. Here is this beautiful document, still available online for everyone to read. We can't decide how to describe this museum. Can you just design something as a placeholder on the cover of the advice of the paper? And Freeman put M for museum, more for plus, and plus for more, because they all knew it had to be a museum and more, which of course became who we are. It was the most wonderful emblematic institutional relationship. It is very productive. A plus is open, it's open-ended. It is not burdened by words like modern and contemporary. And it is a museum and more. And it is a museum that is a global museum for Hong Kong. Our voice comes from within the city. It is a museum for visual culture. So it embraces the disciplines of design, architecture, visual art, moving images. So this multidisciplinary, but then how we manage the conversation within the region and beyond is a very dynamic one. This, together with the museum then forming over that period of 15 years. When we opened in 2021, we are deep in COVID times, but the leader, I always said that when we opened in 2021, we were a museum already of 10 years, because we've been collecting, we've been forming a professional staff, we were developing education programs and an audience, and building a building. So it was a huge piece of work that was happening at the same time, very challenging. what's marvelous about M+ is that as a group of professional staff, we are already embracing the idea of decolonizing an institution, because we are 27 nationalities that are fluent in 16 languages, or within the institution, and with a very strong Pan-Asian emphasis. This allows us to build a position, a framework, a voice from here for the world that is essential. It is a really important institution, not just for Asia, but for the world, because of the content of its collections and its and how we work with them. A very important piece within the collection development was the founding gifts of Dr. Uli Sig. And those of you who were here for the earlier panel, you would have heard from Uli why he plays such an important collection of avant-garde contemporary Chinese art at M+. A group of objects, over 1,500, that now sit within a collection of almost 9,000 objects and 60,000 archives. So this is the founding collection, which you will see when you go and have a look at M+, which I think you all need to do as part of your visit to Hong Kong.
Thank you so much. And absolutely, I love the Apichapong primitive installation in the basement. It's a must visit, and it's my personal highlights of this trip. And because you're seeing some images from the Rockbund Art Museum, so I wanted to share a little bit about the Rockbund Art Museum in Shanghai as well. You probably was asking why there's taxidermies and animals showing up in the screen. We're in a contemporary art conversation. Interesting enough, Rockbund Art Museum, a privately funded public institution starting in 2010. It's among one of a few early private institutions in China. We're in Shanghai. And one really important fact is that this is a museum that was not, had a new building. This building was originally built in 1933 for the Royal Asiatic Society Museum. And that museum, at the time, was the first museum in China. And it was built by Americans and British explorers. And many of them were naturalists. They were in China, part of the kind of missionary exercises in the region, but also they were interested in China from that perspective. And I think Shanghai was a place of cosmopolitanism where a lot of these international narratives were intertwined. And this is where we started this year with a series of programs to really think about how we situate ourselves. Where is Shanghai? And it's no longer from this nationalistic and geopolitics conversation, but rather thinking about what is the vernacular knowledge production from the region, and what is this kind of future imagination that is specific located in a historical past, right? So I think I wanted to use that as a segue into our conversation about knowledge production, because I think institution is very important. We are platforming artists for their projects, their practices, and their thinking. And I think we're a place to really create different encounters for audience where, in China, I think the context is like people don't really understand the difference between a non-profit art museum versus a gallery. They ask why they have to pay to come to see me. And they also ask sometimes, they're like, you don't have paintings. I need a refund. So it's very different audience context. But what we do is we wanted to help people to understand there's many forms of artistic practices you can encounter in many different ways that will open your world and inspires you. And I see images here from the Zeitz MOCAA that were extremely inspiring. So please talk a bit more about the Atelier projects and the images that we're seeing here.
Thank you, X. The Atelier program, and what you see here on the screen now is by when Irshan Adams was in the residency. It's a very simple proposition for the Atelier to have an artist in the museum. But in that process, some fascinating and actually sometimes, kind of difficult interactions occur. So the intention of the project is that an artist have 6 to 9 months in about 400 square meters of galleries in one wing of the museum. There's a stipend and a very generous production budget. It's a blank canvas, and the artist is invited to move in and have pretty much 24-hour access to the museum and the spaces. But then, and often there's also, we don't really have a plan. There's no expectation for a proposal, but the idea is that we can make work and support that production. But it's also not so easy because, I think this is the beautiful thing, because the intention is also is that then our audience has then a direct access to process, but also process can sometimes be very oblique. It's not so clear when something changes. Sometimes it also is quite invasive to have public in your space as an artist. But I think there's been wonderful productive things that's happened in those engagements. And for most of the artists, we had 5 residents so far. Our 6th artist is moving in 2 months' time. Is that
Can I ask for how long?
6 to 9 months. So it's a long period, and it's for Cape Town based.
They don't live there, do they?
No. Well, some people have slept over, but that's also totally okay. But what happens in this space is that there's a curiosity, of course, from audience, but also sometimes misunderstanding, and also but the artist that has been there has really grappled or in what they kind of like embraced was that artists don't really have a direct access to the audience. Also, there's not much dialogue between a regular visitor coming in into the museum. And so the images of Irshan that you saw as well, the kind of, if a dance workshop happening at the same time as an audience work in is absolutely extraordinary. And I think that's the kind of access that also breaks down certain barriers. There's also some museum challenges in terms of, again, I mentioned briefly, of making in an institution. And there's health and safety considerations. Artists also have to come to a certain level of meeting some of those standards for the first time, perhaps, in their practice. But in that process, I think we've done extraordinary work, and all the artists has gone on to also, I think, new stages in their career. But the conversation is not only about the time that they're in the atelier. It's also what happened. We've done new production also, or new works and commissions has come, invitations to other projects at the museum as a result of this engagement. So the curatorial audience, artist mediation is very, very direct. It's not, and often we're called into by a front of house to say, there's a very vexing question from an audience member that doesn't get this and is getting a little upset, and we'll go down, engage, and be there for that conversation. So that's one way, I think, for us that is also kind of, I think it's important for us also to question, and I don't want to go on a tangent, but I have a particular issue around so-called international museum standards, which is something that we are maintaining. Just to be clear, we care for objects very well. We write up there in our kind of, but there's also places where it stifles things, and it's not possible to move much. And I'm also very curious about those places where, and not necessarily about the actual care of objects, but what possibilities it kind of negates. And I know it's a bit oblique, but I might have another moment. I don't want to take too much time here, but
No.
Can I just jump in and say one interesting response to that is that, our audience is young. We had 2.8 million people last year, 2023, and 80% of that audience is aged between 18 and 45. So it's extraordinary. It's like we're speaking to our future. This is this is our generation moving through young youth and into adulthood. And what we have found is an intensity of engagement. And the most frequent question that we are asked is that they want more didactic information for every single object. And so this is a learning process for us to also work with audiences to say, you do bring your own knowledge base to the work, and but at the same time we have to respond. It's a fantastic response. So we've now built a group of docents, and we have them wandering around so that when people want to know, they're there to speak. And because our audience is so multilingual, we have people speaking, in at least 3 languages on the floor. It's also become very clear that the audiences are deeply interested in the SIG collection as the first point of departure into other parts of the collection. But the architecture design collections have been also very inspired for people because they are finding things in there that are on one hand very familiar, and on the other hand questioning why is it there. Mm-hmm. So an example is in our design collections we have the watermelon ball, which was extruded rubber ball made in Hong Kong, one of the first early industrial design, and this is $5 in a Hong Kong shop, very, very cheap. Everybody has had it, and so the question is, why is it in the museum? A museum in many people's minds is something to do with a material culture that is beyond your usual experience. So in a city, and we're in Art Basel here, where the market muscle has grown very substantially, the idea of value has been a cipher through what many people have begun to understand what history is. And we have said, no, but museum is very essential part of a balance that talks about different values, social values, historic values, many other aesthetic value. And so the institution then expands knowledge base around how you see. So the scholarship is really important, but also access points, what you were saying.
For us, taking the cue from both of you, so during the pandemic, we have taken a project called Future of Hope. So because of the pandemic, we realized that there are artists who are stuck in different parts of the world. Especially that was a project based with artists from Bangladesh who were stuck in different regions and different continents. So we titled this project Future of Hope and Creative Transmission Process. So as a foundation, we feel that knowledge transmission and amplifying the voice is very important. And at that time, even for myself, I didn't come from an art background, but we have our back office and we have freelance curators. So who comes with art background? So when I start working on these projects with them, I found out that the hope word at the early time of pandemic was not so much used, but later because nobody probably had the extent of the awareness of the extent of the pandemic. So the hope became a very used word all across. So we thought that how could we use this hope words and transmit these knowledge around it to a community. So then after that project, we realized that the space that we have, we need to have these items or the arts or the installation that will give a new identity to a community. As Suhanya has said, that the audience in the art spaces has significantly changed, the demography has changed, so that how do we attract the young generation, or how do we give something to them? So we started a program only last 6 months ago. We started inviting students from art institutions, schools, and right now we have these photographs from Magnum photographer Raghu Roy, and that was taken during 1971, during our War of Liberation. And these were never published in the last 52 years. And so the generations, even for us, we know many things, but we have never, seeing is believing. So this archival images because we live in Bangladesh. We know that every people from our generation or new generations, how they're impacted with the War of Liberation of 1971. So we bring it to the public. But again, that is, of course, the transmission of knowledge. But then we wanted to make it a versatile. So we added art from South Africa, Nigeria, India, and from China. These, so that, and those can talk with the photographs. So like just an example, like we put a work of William Kentridge along with this War of Liberation photographs. So that work William Kentridge did during the apartheid time. So that struggle that generation has suffered in that part of the region is a similar struggle that happened during the 1971 in Bangladesh. So we try to correlate, and it's that diversity and that extension of the artistic practices, so that we want to offer to the community so that they get energized, not to, sometimes some people, as X has said, that people come and say, well, there's no art, give us our money back. So we just don't want that people come to our space and see photography and say, well, I thought I came to see an art space, why all this photography? So I consider myself photography as an art, but some wider audience may not. So we try to mix and match so that everybody has their piece of enjoyment or satisfaction, and on the end, this knowledge and that talking. So this is, as we said, that decolonized conversation, that a new definition to the community.
Thank you all so much. I think one really kind of a common thread that I'm picking on is actually the importance of institution to changing people's mind in value. What is valued and how things are valued and what positionalities are should be emphasized and highlight with their value positions from the margins, narratives from the margins. And also, I think different from all your institutions, Rockbund Art Museum we're not a collecting institution, and you all are a collecting institution. I think working on a collection and offering the care to taking care of that collection is a very important form of knowledge production, and also a very important form of offering and centering value in those objects. I wonder if you can, or maybe we can this time start with you, Suhanya, talk a bit more about, you talk about M+ started way back. You know, you guys first building the collection first, and then the building comes. I think nowadays people think about museum, they think about the architecture, the building, but that's never the case, right? It's the people, it's the objects, it's the artists come first. So maybe let's go back to that origin and thinking about how you started building a collection that is so multidisciplinary, from the watermelon bowl to fantastic, say, collections, you know. So let's start with you.
So it goes back to what the people had wanted within their lives. And actually, even to take a step back, the formation of West Kowloon Cultural District, Donald Tsang, who was the then chief executive, decided to put aside a big parcel of land in Hong Kong for major cultural institutions, because he believed that it was through culture that he felt Hong Kong needed to know who we are, what is our identity. And it is through cultural institutions that this needed to happen. So that, you know, goes right back to a profoundly important recognition that these objects across disciplines are an essential touchstone. And I do think of our institutions as spirit houses. You know, this is where we think about who we are. So the issue of how we protect, conserve, keep, while making accessible and open the collections is a tension. And it is a very productive tension, because artists will persuade and push sort of institutional norms. But we also need to be open to that. And I think that is, as modern and contemporary institutions, we have to be alert. So the discussions around the conservation of objects is ongoing, but necessary. You know, this is something we have discussed as well, because it's, you know, do we keep things forever or not? What are our conditions? How are we being sustainable? We have to know that, you know, climate crisis is a fact. How are we, as museums, responsible? How do we make our obligations clear to the people who come through the door? These are continual questions that we argue and think about, but at the same time, act on as well. You know, of course, museum best practice sits at the base of that, but we also make arguments about expanding and being more exploratory about how things could exist in space. And there is no question that our opportunity is that we work with living makers, whether they're architects, designers, or artists. And so the process of interviewing is an essential kind of primary source that is there in the longevity of our collections. But I think our collections, I believe very deeply in the museum and in the collecting institution, because it is through those collections that we remember who we are. And it is very easy to erase memory if you erase collections. And so the protection of those collections are vital.
Brilliant. And go ahead.
That sounds a little bit like a challenge. No, I'm teasing. Thank you. Just for Zeitz MOCAA, the co-founder of the museum, Johann Zeitz, is a German collector, and the initial relationship with our institution was that about 600 objects would be on a long loan to the museum, and in June 22, it became a permanent gift. So, which I think was a significant step for the institution. I think it resolved some questions about the founding of the institution also. But also I want to say that since the pandemic, we have not actively kind of collected, largely due to also kind of urgencies around funding and survival. It is really something that we're giving a lot of thought into, and will kind of also start again. But our focus has shifted significantly also with the arrival of Koyokuo in May 2019 into a kind of a very dynamic exhibitions program and discursive program. So I think that became a very important part of establishing the institution and the kind of a framework for us to operate from. That said, we are about to launch the African Art Resource Center, which is a focused archive for contemporary African art in its diaspora. We should be public in the next 2 months, generously supported by the Mellon Foundation. And I think that's also the aspect of the work where I think maybe perhaps a little bit more of our attention will go into in the next year or two. And if and when, kind of the opportunity for additional work, collecting comes. I want to qualify a little bit about, the aspects of what it means to conserve and to look after objects. It's fundamental. I think it's important that we look after that. But I think we do know also that there's debates and research happening about what those conditions should be. And unfortunately, as a relatively small institution on the tip of the African continent, we don't always have the leverage necessarily. And I think it's interesting that a year and a half ago, German institutions started investing heavily into research about can they drop the 22 degrees, 50% humidity because of a climate crisis that has hit. Now, that's a debate that I can't really forward, but I'm excited to hear it. I'm in a context where we have rolling blackouts, where we have a diesel generator blowing smoke into the air, for us to be able to maintain those conditions so that in the case when we do have significant international exhibitions that we can negotiate our loans. And that's the context for that. I think we also, what I mean when I speak about this, and it's not a kind of important aspect, but yeah, that's my contribution to that.
So I don't know how many of you have an idea about the city of Dhaka. So Dhaka is because the country Bangladesh is 55,000 square miles and 180 million people. And Dhaka itself is a small city, which is the capital city. It is habited by 18 million people. So the place is very scarce, expensive. And to have an art space to showcase art is, I would say, considered as a luxury, and there is no such government support or city or a neighborhood support that encourages this kind of cultural space. So since I went to school, I've seen many private initiatives kind of starts and vanishes because of not that they have not intentions, but it is not commercially feasible to run these spaces in a city like Dhaka. So then we come to talk about spaces. And before the foundation was built, established in 2018, and the space in 2020, I've been an art collector. So the collection has been a very important part during my art journey. But again, but when we founded Durjoy Bangladesh Foundation, we figured it out. There are art collections that we could collect without bringing it to the private foundation's umbrella. So that was a program that we started acquiring artwork for loaning to different European institutions or donating them, which has never thought to bring South Asian art inside their museum or galleries. Just an example, in 2018, we donated a large work of Mithushen, Indian female contemporary artist work to a museum in Germany from our collection, which we thought, from the date of acquiring, we knew that it is going to be established in an institution because it's so huge. We knew in Dhaka is not a right place to set it up. So it went to Kunstmuseum Augsburg, 1.5 hours from Berlin. But the reason is, it's not that we are donating the artwork. This is a way of establishing South Asian voice to an European land. And we figured it out. Without that time, we didn't know that was the first time in 2018 a major public institution first time collected a female contemporary artist work from South Asia. So this is a kind of when we talk about decolonialization or amplifying, we thought that, well, being a foundation and being an institute, we can give away or we can put our collection in spaces which gives an identity. And that was the beginning, just to give you a little bit information on that. That was the beginning of that Kunstmuseum Augsburg to start South Asian collection, because their audience became very, very interested. We put that work into their exhibition of 25 years anniversary. And after that, they collected work of Gauri Gill and other Vartike's work, since our work went to donation. And then a lot of our, because collection is a very important factor, but a lot of our work, which are not South Asia centric, it is being collected because it has some relevance with South Asia, like an artist from Ghana. So he makes tapestries with jerry cans. And when I grew up, we used to carry jerry cans, not in the yellow color, but white color to carry waters to store. So there are relationships. So we just don't bring European or African or South American artwork to our space, so that we want to bring those work to our space, which will also has some relation and also have some interest. When we go to Middle East, we take to the work that has relevance to that from our collection to their culture, their perspective, their struggle, so that these way we could amplify a broader sense of new decolonialization message that this is possible in a new way.
I want to jump in on a thought that just occurred to me while you were speaking, is that what we are also doing is within our institutions decentering some of the sort of major canonical figures of art history in terms of how we also work with them within our institutions because of our collections. And an example of this would be for M+, I mean, I could think of a few, but let me talk through architecture. So we have the Archigram Archive, and Archigram is a great experimental architecture studio out of the UK, Britain. And we were very keen to place that archive with M+, because we could do something with that material that could never be done anywhere else because of our collections of Hong Kong architects, but also architects like Isozaki or MAD architects from Beijing, very experimental studio practices that are moving architecture into even the metaverse, because there was Archigram talking about Zoom in 1962, and then we are all Zooming during COVID times. But they were thrilled to place that archive at M+, precisely because they could see that it opens up conversations that you couldn't do outside. So yes, we can decenter from the European canonical sense, but also then within the region, our inter-regional discussions and discourses are as important. So these two sit in parallel.
No, absolutely. As you were all speaking, I just kind of have the thought that the way to decolonizing an institution is actually about create affordance for audience to be in that space. And the learning that we're championing, it's not the preceptor learning where you think something as truth, right, presented to you as truth, but rather it's a learning of self-discovery. And in the process of self-discovery, you have to be able to situate yourself in space, in relation with objects, peoples, narratives, stories. I think, a lot of audience, let's say if they grew up in Shanghai and then they go to an institution in Dakar, they might not be able to situate themselves immediately. But this is why the inter-regional and also kind of thinking about this new complex geography that we are living in and creating narratives and connecting these narratives in different institutions become very important, because eventually we are all interconnected. And you can think through many different perspective from economy and from trade routes and from people's movements and from resource migration, right? So there's many ways that we have living in a deeply interconnected world. And then the narratives and the storytellings has to be interconnected to that way too. So I wonder in your, maybe this time we can go back to Storm, in your practice and at Zeitz, is there any ways that you're thinking about these quote-unquote world making in a way that it's not necessarily a generic world making, but grounded in a very specific location, but thinking beyond?
Absolutely. Like I said earlier, I think we understand our position in the world as an entanglement. And in that entanglement, there's also extraordinary narratives and stories. In August this year, we will open a solo exhibition survey by Tuan Nguyen, the Vietnamese-American artist, who did an extraordinary research project in film on Senegalese encounter as part of French colonialism and the Second World War, and Vietnamese, and so an extraordinary film and installation that's coming to our institution, which we're very happy to host. And this is an example where an artist shines a light and brings a narrative that's been erased, neglected, and forgotten. And I think one of the most extraordinary moments, the first time I saw this 2 years ago in Dakar in Senegal, weeping. And I think these are the kind of narratives that we bring in. And I think also for us, we've done a project also on the Indian Ocean, the connection between the Afro-Asian relationships, which is very strong, of course, and so deeply part of our history, not only in South Africa, but the Swahili Sea. So I think there's ways that we think about it. And I think the last point on this is that what Koyo Kuo, our director, calls the black geographies, the understanding that Africa, that we also understand kind of that's a expanded kind of understanding of how we connected. And those projects that bring in these conversations have been very powerful for us. For example, When We See Us group exhibitions, we look at a century of black figurative painting by black artists. Done two things. It's like connected us intrinsically to the rest of the world through images, but it's also expanded this notion of the contemporary by stretching it by a century. And so for these to happen in one space, and we're very proud that will open at Kunstmuseum Basel in May this year.
Congratulations. I've been following that, and I actually saw the catalog of all places in, I say, Boston. Wow. So I think books travels and the knowledge goes. And we're very excited to see Trevor representing Hong Kong for Venice, and I know M+ is very instrumental to establish the Venice Pavilion. Maybe Suhanya, you can talk a bit more about how M+ not only actually in Hong Kong, literally you're also outside Hong Kong
yes.
too.
For us, so just in relation to Venice Biennale, the Hong Kong Pavilion has, this is the 6th edition that M+ works with Hong Kong Arts Development Council to present. It was very controversial when it was first mooted and undertaken, when Lars Nidvi, who's the director, and huge debates of whether an institution should be doing this. But what it has meant is that we've been able to use the curatorial scholarly voice to lift and bring the artist into a space which is very crowded, full of many artists, many pavilions, to bring Hong Kong to the world. And this, of course, is a critical part of M+'s work as well, this two-way dialogue. But we also take exhibitions out. This is for the first time in Hong Kong. There is a museum that makes producers, researchers, and then takes those exhibitions to other audiences. So this is essential work.
I also really loved the black and white
Yes.
exhibition at
Yes.
M+ right now, which is a collaboration
Yes.
with a national gallery from Paris.
Yes,
right?
so the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. So, when we work with those major European institutions, we insist that they have to work with us and open up how the exhibitions are formed. And it was really very productive because this is the first institution to begin collecting photography. It has 8 million objects, French, where photography was invented. They had no question, it was an art form. But of course, history is much bigger than what those collections are. So we inserted works from our collections, and it's really fabulous. You can see Vivan Sudram right next to Diane Arbor's It's excellent.
No, I absolutely loved it. And I think you also did a brilliant decision to keep the frame different color. So you're literally annotating through that history, right? This is what expanding the canon does.
Looks like.
Yeah, and looks like. And Durjoy, I want to just say we were both seeing Columbus Scope in Sri Lanka, and you guys supported a project for the forest ways, which I think is also very important to kind of thinking about bringing different institutions to a region, and then also that project will later on travel to other places, and I think one of the project is coming to Shanghai later on. So maybe you already talked about your work of placing and donating work into European institutions, but maybe talk a bit more about commissioning projects and how you platforming artists.
A few days ago, last Sunday actually, somebody asked me, so what is your future? I said, the future is today. So the reason I said that what we plan today is actually decides our future. And when you said about the Columbus Scope, this is the Columbus Scope. Yes, I know Natasha very well, but the Columbus Scope, as I earlier mentioned, that there is always a relevance. Something is there with DBF, Durjoy Bangladesh Foundation. So it has an influence to be collaborated. And Suhanya just said that connection between the borders is very important. We started with Kochi Biennial. The Columbus Scope, our engagement started a long time ago because one of the artists, Jihan Karim, is our artist for our residency program in 2021 in Eindhoven, Netherlands. So that was also our excitement that, well, one of our artists is in this program. And then Shuruvi Jannat, we supported her for during when we first met the space. There was an Italian contemporary art event called Giornata del Contemporaneo. When we brought the Italian artist to Bangladesh. So she participated that project. So there was from our side, there was an interest that when we saw that these are the artists that are selected, so we immediately respond back to the collaboration request. But one of the most important that even a few days ago, one of the very important curator from London was saying that we have a program that is probably unique in its nature, that is not an award program only. That is, we call it DBF KMB Award with Hayward Gallery. So the award recipient from the biennial work of that emerging artist gets an exhibition in Hayward Gallery. So this is a very important, I would say, career boosting incentive for an emerging artist from this region to get an exhibition space in space like Hayward. And now our extension of that, because how do we amplify these? Okay, there's an exhibition happens, but this year we are going to announce in Venice there will be a multi-year lecture series, Durjoy Bangladesh lecture series in Hayward Gallery, and it is going to invite South Asian art practitioners, artists, and including diaspora South Asian artists that lives in Europe to have a conference and a day-long lecture series in Hayward Gallery. So this is, of course, when we talk about the free voice, or this is become a topic of recent times. So how do we cannot just go on the street and say that we need our voice. I think this is a very innovative way, or probably a courteous way to express South Asian voice to a wider community. And so we call it lecture series. So there are different approaches that I think giving us a new form of free colonized approach.
Absolutely. I think knowledge production is so important. And You know, I was in Jamaica a few years ago doing a conference, and I was in the National Gallery. You know, they had no internet. You know, like when we talk about imbalance, like resource imbalances for real, right? And then able to build programs in Asia, in South Africa, and in Dhaka, I think that matters so much. And I think the continuation and this long journey of committed to the region, I think it's the most important thing. And then we have to probably work together. I have been always telling all my institution leader friends, we have to create a consortium. Maybe CMAM is already doing that actually, to really think about how we can collaborate more. And we are in a time where resource is in scarcity, right? We have to think about being innovative, kind of thinking about what sustainable institution practice means. What does a just institution practice means today? With that, I see the timer is at 0, but I think maybe we'll open for 1 or 2 questions. Okay, we already have 2. Please, go ahead.
Sorry, my name is Hannah, and I run a gallery in India. And what you said about international museum standards and caring for objects really resonated with me. So what I wanted to ask is, and I also work primarily with younger artists. So when you have artists at the atelier who haven't produced to that scale before, do you provide, like, does the museum provide support in terms of production, in terms of conservation, kind of just being like, hey, you can't stick to the wall with masking tape? That, and then how are you dealing with the issue of conservation? Because 18 degrees or 20 degrees and maintaining that level of humidity becomes unsustainable in a climate where it's just not like that. So how do you kind of deal with that?
Thank you. I think two questions quickly. Responses. I think that an object being made in a museum means that it comes in as raw material, and it has a particular kind of insurance value. Okay, and in a process, at some point it becomes an artwork, and so it changes then the insurance part. Yep. So we have a very good registrar that's tracking. When we had our last resident moved out, Onati didn't tell Lee about the 50 new drawings that he had stashed. So it was condition reporting then. So we're very clear about every object is condition reported, whether it's material or it's an object. So, and in that process, you work into it. So it's just becoming incredibly administratively kind of complex, but it's important. And I think for many of the artists who are some emerging artists, it's been an incredible process for them to also kind of be in this. And I think for the first time being proper care. One of our residents has been working with a commercial gallery before, and the exchange was that they can have a vehicle to go and pick up recycled materials in exchange for a project. So no budget, and so we're very clear. There's a significant amount, and then also support, meaning like from production through to finding the right suppliers and all of that. So we become also like essentially a artwork production institution, which was not necessarily the intention. But we work also very, very, very small team that has become very skilled and adapted to this process of fluidity in the museum, but still bringing it back into the kind of systems. Yeah, to answer your questions.
Can we take one more? Oh, there's more than one. Can we? No, we cannot. Okay. I'm so sorry, but maybe stick around and ask the panelists to a question. But it's such a joy to be in conversation with you all, and thank you so much, and thank you everyone for coming.